kids, David, who was still at state. So, we hear the saying, there's a phrase that is associated with the Holocaust. That phrase is never again. Never again, people say, as regards that never again shall we allow our societies to implode, to botch, if you will, on the grounds of such ideologies that spur on the abuse of humanity. The genocidal abuse of humanity. Never again, they say. And yet, if we are to be the watchmen of the future, if we are to stand on the precipice of tomorrow and say never again, then history needs to be understood, lest history be repeated. So never again is somewhat of a hollow statement if one has no grasp on what gave rise to the atrocities of the Holocaust. We are told that it was a product of racism, that it was a product of that baser instinct of racist individuals who seek only to malign the rest of humanity. And yet the racism of 1920s Germany, 1930s Germany, the racism of Western societies in the 20s and 30s is not the racism that we understand it today. What we are told as regards to racism today is that racism is a fear of others who don't look like you. Racism is is based in those that are insecure with their own social standing, and so they feel threatened by others. Therefore, they attribute hostility towards those people whom are different, who look different. But the racism of Western racism in the 20s and 30s wasn't really about the outwards appearance of a person. It was really based in this idea of social Darwinism and the eugenics movement, which purported that just as species in nature have evolved into a food chain, if you will, a hierarchy of organisms, so also in human society there is a kind of hierarchy wherein those at the top can be represented as the sort of those from which the Industrial Revolution was born, those from which the Enlightenments, were born up, of those more pristine, those more perfectly evolved factions of humanity. And that, of course, then would imply that there are these lower factions of humanity that are sort of the leftover products of genetics of the past, peoples that lived in tents, peoples that hunted with bows and arrows, people that represented less evolved societies were also genetically, this was explained through genetics. Crime was explained as a function of genetics. In 1920s Western societies, this was the accepted science, and this indeed is the important point here, if you can take away that this was the science of the day. It was the agreed upon science. There was a consensus, if you will, as regards the ideas of social Darwinism and the effects of it upon society. This is how you explain poverty. This is how you explained inequity. This is how you explained the problems of human life were explained as the function of genetics. And so there was definitely conversation. Progressives in America discussed it. The eugenics movement really found its legs in America in the turn of the century, and the idea is that you have this whole swath of peoples that are likened to, as Margaret Sanger stated, the founder of Planned Parenthood, she called them human weeds. That they were a burden on society. They held us back. If you will, the garden of humanity could not flourish because it was infested with weeds, with human weeds. And so this is really where the Third Reich was coming from when they sought to exterminate whole swaths of the European population. They were doing it, in their estimation, as they saw it for the greater good. As such is always the statement of collectivists, of those fascists and collectivists of the 20th century, that was always purported to be for the greater good, what was best for the people, for the nation. Not just for the nation, but for the collective good of society, that these things must be done. And I don't think anyone in the 1930s had a stomach for what happened in the 1940s. But over time, it's slowly, people become desensitized. The first execution camps didn't house Jews. The first groups of people, I think in the late 1930s, that the Nazis exterminated, committed genocide against, were disabled peoples that were born with deformities, people that were deaf, people that had, seemingly genetic imperfections, weeds, if you will, as they purported. And these were the first groups of people that were killed, and so it's important to understand this. I think it was like 100,000 people were killed they were gassed with automotive exhaust. They put them in rooms and ran pipes into them and ran automotive exhaust and killed off all kinds of people that they saw as undesirable peoples. The social Darwinists of the 1930s, and it was not only in Germany, but the Germans were industrious enough to take the popular ideas of the day and apply them to industry, as cold and antiseptic as that may sound. The 1930s Germany was awash in the turmoil of post-World War Europe, post-World War I Europe. And it may have seemed that in the fracturing of their societies and the struggles of the 1920s, we had the Big Depression in the United States, huge economic collapses. It may have seemed that there was a kind of storm of crises in which society was enraptured, if you will, a crisis of genetics, a crisis of undesirable peoples burdening, dragging down society. The Germans accused the Jews of being capitalists, greedy, money-mongering capitalists. So when the Third Reich gets associated with the right, that's just not the case. It was as left as you get, man. When you're accusing your enemies of being capitalists, that's not something the right does. That's something that the left does. They find fault with the bankers. They find fault with the corporations. They find fault with the business owners. They find fault with the individual's, right to his own life. For they see that the collectivists see that the greater good is really the concern of the day, not the individual. And so for the greater good, the Third Reich felt that there was an impending threat. We in this day and age, our impending threat is climate change. That's sort of the conversation in society. Climate change is this impending threat. We have to make drastic changes We have to take effort. We have to make drastic steps. Well, in 1930s Germany, man, they felt that there was a crisis in their midst, and they needed to take drastic measures. And progressives all over the West were calling for it to greater and lesser degrees. You know, when Margaret Sanger talked about human weeds, you know, what do you do with weeds? You pull them up. You know, there was talk about what to do with the human weeds, to put them all into colonies. The Germans talked about sending all the Jews to down into Africa, get rid of them, just displace them off into another continent. You know, this was the intellectual fodder of the day. It was not the insecurity and fear and just base hatred that we think of racism in the 21st century. Racism in those days were different. It was based in different principles, different ideas. It was, if you will, the evil of ideas, not the insecurity of the unintelligent. It was very intelligent, very informed people that purported the need to dispatch swaths of humanity, to ghost swaths of humanity for the greater good. And so to the effect that we will say never again. We must first understand, you know, what it is that we are saying never to. To say never again to the Holocaust must, in some measure, to say never again to the collectivists' ambitions of those who hold the greater good above the interests of the individual. Never again, you know, will we dehumanize one another with our supposed science of the day. You know, never again can we frame political agendas that have the effect of tribalism and pitting one group against another. Never again. All right, man. Food for thought. God bless. Take care. See you guys next time.